So, thank you. I will talk about the ethical principles that we should reflect on in relation to a pandemic. And the basic assumption is that we are all human beings, irrespective of if we live in Sweden or if we live in South Sudan. So that's kind of the global ethics or global justice perspective. Now I'll see if this works. Here maybe. Sorry, tänker du Anna? Okay. Where you live should not determine whether you live. You shall soon be aware of why I have this as my title. We all know how unprepared we were when this pandemic hit the world. And in the beginning of 2020, there was this ignorance made us look for help. There was a fight of medical equipment. Former allies suddenly became enemies in order to grab as much equipment as possible to their home countries, etc., etc. I will, though, focus on one specific question, the question of distribution of vaccines. And it was very hopeful when world leaders published an article in Washington Post in, I think it was August already 2020, with the title, "The international community must guarantee equal global access to a COVID-19 vaccine." And this this article were published together by Pierre Trudeau, the Canadian Prime Minister, Ramaphosa from South Africa, a number of others, including also Stefan Löfven, Swedish Prime Minister, as you perhaps remember. It was some time ago. But and this article, the message was global access. And one specific quotation here is very important, I think. Where you live should not determine whether you live, and global solidarity is central to saving lives and protecting the economy. This was very hopeful when this message got out to the world. What happened in practice? Well, quite soon. Well, first, of course, why this is important to state this. Now something happened with my, you can hear me anyway, I suppose. Because if you look at the global gaps, and this is just to see what the expenditure on global health, how much different countries, just quite arbitrarily selected, can afford to put in the healthcare. Armenia, $407 per capita, Bangladesh, 36, Congo, 20, Sweden, 5,900, and US, almost a double. Of course, there are always problems with numbers. I'm sure that there are some other resources for these countries here which are very low. But anyway, these figures tell us, I think, enough that where you live really determine whether you live in the world we live in. So this initiative was, of course, fantastic. What happened then? Well, quite soon we can see in already the autumn 2020 that the search for vaccine, and the development of new vaccines, which came so fast that everyone was astonished, even before it was produced or had come to be able to be distributed, the richest country had already bought up, for example, 80% of Pfizer vaccines. They had grabbed this, and this was something different than what this article's message was, wasn't it? So this made us, of course, worry a little what will happen here. And what happened was, and one who wondered here was, of course, Tedros Ghebreyesus, the WHO general director, who constantly warned against, and he said that the world was on the brink of a catastrophic moral failure, which, of course, came so much against what these world leaders announced already in the summer. So what happened? Well, after about 2 years, now we have here the taken from the World Bank, the world in data. What happened with the distribution of COVID vaccines? Well, the warning from the autumn proved to be unfortunately also true. We see that the high-income countries and the upper middle-income countries, they had in April 2022 already achieved about 80% vaccination, at least one dose, while the low-income countries very, very slowly raised up till about 10 to 15% at that time. So even in this respect, it seems to be the fact that where you live really determine whether you live. Let me now, this was facts about what happened. Now let me go over to some ethical reflection. I can say, is it really a problem then? Because that was also the message at this time. Well, COVID hit the older population at the hardest. And while we live in the rich countries, people live longer, and therefore we need more of the COVID vaccines. However, this seemed to be untrue, in fact. If you look closer, and I think even my predecessor Mia here told us that this is something which we should not believe, because these health systems in these countries, they are so fragile with this tiny funding, of course, that they have no means to treat COVID-19 patients in intensive care, as we can see, so that costs a lot. So they have to make a lockdown, and then people who live just at the borderline of survival will lose perhaps the job. Children will not go to the get necessary education, etc., etc. So these effects, which is not perhaps direct effects of COVID, but indirect effects of COVID, will lead also to deaths, and one death is similar to another death. But also so that the figures of cases seem to be also very much underestimated in many of these countries, perhaps because of bad statistics or whatever. COVID-19 death toll four times higher in low-income countries than rich ones. We could read in The Economist in 2022. Of course, there are other reasons also for this low vaccination rate. Obviously, there is so many structural, institutional problems. But one, and the major, as far as I can understand from my reading, it was that the rich countries took the vaccines to themselves very much in the beginning. Okay, so which ethical principles should we now try to follow, given that the situation is that it is? So this was a question that we addressed in our report from Smer, and we formulated two principles. One, global justice. The other, international solidarity. These are in some way complementary. And I will refer to them now and go over to some concepts that were also introduced in the discussion, the global discussion, not least by the WHO General Director, namely vaccine nationalism, which he said was the problem here, and then opposite would be vaccine cosmopolitanism. And these seem to be in conflict, and how should we then think when we address such an ethical conflict? That will be my question for the next 5 minutes. Start with vaccine cosmopolitanism. That would, in this context, imply that every human being, irrespective of nationality, has the same right to vaccination against fatal viruses. Against things that threaten your life, we have the same rights. Why? Well, sometimes ethicists raise the question why, which seems to be unnecessary, because sometimes the answers seem to be so obvious. But let me just give you some reasons anyway. Well, the first reason would be a principle of human dignity, which is the first principle also in our Swedish priority platform. Each human life is of equal importance, and each human life is equally valuable. That is kind of a basic ethical principle. We can discuss them afterward. I think I will not get any question about questioning this principle. The other principle would be formulated in this way: no one should be worse off because of her poor luck in the natural lottery. We all happen to come to existence. We don't choose our parents. We don't choose our social class. We don't choose our nation. We are just here. Irrespective, we are here, born in Sudan, or we are born in Sweden. And this fact, this arbitrary fact, this luck or unluck, should not decide how good lives. This is also a basic principle in ethics, which is behind a lot of different theories of justice, for example. So these are two reasons why vaccine cosmopolitan is such an important. And you can see the other principle is, in fact, very similar in content to the message from the political leaders, saying that where you live should not determine whether you live. There was a lot of critique of vaccine nationalists from the WHO director, from the UN General Secretary, etc., during this period of time, during this discussion. The definition is something like this: citizenship is a relevant factor for decision on priorities of vaccination. Why? Well, sometimes it was said that it was just a matter of greed. We are selfish as individuals. Nations are selfish. That's just how it is. We have to accept it. But if you look a little closer to this, I think we can at least see that there are some reasons why political leaders in a nation has a specific responsibility for their own citizens. That has been developed in the literature in political philosophy. Just a very short summary here, saying that government is based on contractual obligation, entailing moral principles, trust, solidarity, consent. People expect that their government should try to get as much vaccines, or at least enough vaccines to their own citizens. Political leaders have primary obligations to their fellow citizens. That would be the underpinning, and perhaps in some way moral underpinning also for nationalists. But here we have then a conflict, which for an ethicist is, wow, this is very interesting. How shall we deal with such a conflict? We have good reasons behind vaccine cosmopolitanism, this universalistic view, talking about global justice and international solidarity, also in line with that. But also there are some good reasons why leaders of nations must also think of their own population. How shall we think here? Well, I have no answer, unfortunately, but perhaps we can in a way formulate this in some way, middle way here, saying that, okay, we must accept that states have the right to vaccinate in accordance with obligation to their citizens, but they also have moral duties to ensure that the global population has sufficient level of vaccines to survive. I sometimes think about this as in a family living in a house. I have to take care, well, when I was younger and my children were younger, I had to take care of them as best as I could, give them food and toys and everything. Outside of my house, there's suddenly 10 starving children who almost are dying. What are then my priorities? How should I continue just to act as this picture is not there, or they are not there, the children? Or do I have to change my priority? And I think this is kind of a similar situation between nations and the global responsibilities. Which I call a modified vaccine cosmopolitan, would imply that each human being, irrespective of nationality, has the same right to be vaccinated against COVID-19. Even though when we have come up to some certain level of survival, of sufficient lives, states, of course, or leaders could prioritize their own population, but on the assumption that this basic floor is there, so to say, for sufficiency. Okay, so then where you live does not determine whether you live, if this would happen. And could it happen, or would it happen, or did it happen? The practical implication of this, what would that be? Well, one fantastic initiative when it comes to the distribution of COVID of vaccines was, of course, COVAX. We all know what COVAX implied. And this gave also rich nations a fantastic possibility to donate and donate and donate to vaccines in poorer countries, so they could increase the vaccination rate there. So that would be one possibility, which was at least in the right direction. Another possibility, which was addressed by South Africa and India to the WTO, World Trade Organization, was to just for a few years, can we waive patent rights so there could be more producers of vaccines? For example, Indian companies who are the ability to produce vaccines, why shouldn't they be able to do that? And that would be perfectly in line with the rules for the property rights, the TRIPS agreement, which is behind this, which is the basis for this policy. And this proposal got support from, for example, the Doctors Without Borders and from other NGOs from after a short while, over 100 countries, from the US, from France, but not from Europe, not, of course, from the companies that were producing the vaccines. So here we have a struggle going on for, this is just some of the support for this proposal from in the journal Nature. Page behavior on COVID vaccines is right and fair was the title of the editorial in Nature. Even the WTO new chief welcomes COVID shot patent plans, drug makers balk. Finally, in May, June this year, the TRIPS Council, after a long time, many years of reflection, what happened during these 2 years? Well, people were dying from COVID because there were no decision to be able to increase the production of vaccines. But then there was a compromise. So after the summer, it was possible. But now the COVID vaccines are perhaps not that much needed anymore. So my conclusion is that a modified vaccine cosmopolitans, which encompasses the principle of global justice and international solidarity on one hand, and the duties of government to their own citizens on the other. But it doesn't, as you understand, justify or legitimize that governments in the rich countries does not care about what's happening outside the borders. It provides a midway solution between vaccine cosmopolitanism and vaccine nationalism, which we saw have to be in some way balanced. And it corresponds to the declarations of world leaders of international solidarity in a time of pandemics. Remember, where you live should not determine whether you live. Could be realized through joint efforts of the WTO, the WHO, COVAX, other international as well as national actors. So it's open, it's just a start. So, thank you. This is how it was, and perhaps we should try and learn something from how it could be in the next pandemic. And don't forget that no one is safe until everyone is safe. Thank you.
Thank you, Göran. I think that the two expressions that you mentioned, vaccine nationalism and vaccine cosmopolitanism.
It's a horrible word.
Yeah, it is a very hard word. I think that's really interesting, but can you explain in more detail the ethical basis of these two expressions and how they conflict to each other? Do they conflict?
Yeah, I tried to say something about it, of course, but you can have a long discussion about it because it's these ideal principles, which I think no one would question, that every human being has the same value, or that we should not be, that where we are born should not determine whether we can live or die if we die. These are self-evident principles. So every one of us, I think, are vaccine cosmopolitans. Cosmopolitans as an ethical ideal. Anyone who would object here, I don't know, perhaps. But we also see that this vaccine nationalism has some points. That is not only greed, but it's some reasons why the leaders have prioritized their own populations. So this kind of tricky conflict will have us in practice to do some kind of compromises, although we shouldn't leave the ideal. I mean, this is not the ideal principle is, in my view, which also I think I've stated in my conclusion, that every human being has the same value. I mean, we cannot avoid that basic principle, and therefore this kind of crisis will always challenge our morality, and we have to be aware of it and not just try to look away. Yeah, so that would be my response to that.
Interesting.